Hello everyone, today we talk about the Fourth Lateran Council, a topic for which not even 1000 videos would ever be enough. I've never made a video about a single council, let alone the Lateran ones. However, we will start from somewhere. This channel is, as you know, particularly caring about Catholic history before even the Christian one. I have an increasing amount of people posing the same old question. I'd never heard that Catholicism existed before Christianity. Your problem, alright? I don't have to explain that every time. I have just to warn you, to inform you, let's say better, to threaten you. In some ways, naturally telling you that I have made plenty of videos on these topics and I do not digress on them all the time, otherwise and these videos that are already long enough on their own would literally never end. But surprise, surprise, made thousands of videos on YouTube, so I think at this point, say, if I go to university and I ask a scholar, as you would do with me, like regarding, you know, what you're talking about for your work, the first answer that you receive is, go watch everything I've done, and then ask me that question again if you still have it, by the way. So this is very important, as much as, you know, realizing that whoever doesn't have like elementary Christian historical education basically doesn't have the fundamentals to understand literally any topic whatsoever, not just historically, though history encompasses everything, but every single political, national, moral, scientific one alike. I will not also explain further, or at least this is clear whenever I make the reference, also the mere content, the mere topic that eventually will be discussed, right? So today, of course, we do not just look for the first time approaching the Fourth Lateran Council and its surroundings. We do not go immediately in depth into it. At some point we could do it starting from some aspects of the same, but it's important always to introduce the topic as well in a more general and approachable way. I have definitely hundreds of videos on Christian history. There's a dedicated playlist, settles the rest of the premise. We have seen recently, the other day actually, speaking, for example, about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons, what the primary focus of the church had been, right? And we're talking mostly the Church of Rome, considering not just its primacy of honor, charity, and more, but of course its autonomy and especially spiritual hegemony that was already wielding not just in Latin-Germanic Europe, but beyond. The relations between the Church and of Rome and the one of Constantinople are crucial, also in a comparative sense, to explain what was going on in the East and why that system failed eventually against the same Roman Catholic one. Also the only one that, because of that Roman primacy, had ever being contemplated. It's not like, I don't know, that Constantinople could act at some point as an alter Rome, or Toledo could act as an alter Rome, which is a very important idea considering, in fact, the primacy of the Roman Church after the so-called Gregorian reforms that is too often the sort of scapegoat for any kind of pseudo-historical criticism towards anything, right? Everything is the fault of the Catholic Church, especially when you look at essentially at this point even post-Christian, but formerly Protestant realities. Like, you realize that the average person, of course, doesn't know history anywhere in the world, but has very specifically and surgically ingrained this notion that essentially this would be the institution out of which every single evil came out, essentially washing, fakely washing themselves of any person or responsibility, any church they belong to, any country they belong to, any polity they belong to, or the mere fact of being humans, so literally dirty people, as the Latin etymology of the term stems from, which is very different from the one of mankind, right? that the Church, in fact, quite strongly aims to restore. And take also the obvious nonsensical earthly reality for ignoring the fact that there are two separated natures, the heavenly one, of course, being detached from the lower human one, and not realizing in that sense what's the role of the Church as a medium. Why? And being able to, of course, to simply distinguish between the office and the people who cover it, which evidently is too difficult to understand. And again, nobody really understands why the Catholic Church should be per se, other than the obvious power, prestige, and authority that it wielded. So something that, of course, existentially threatens lesser people at every level of their being. And of course, will produce that reaction in a world of fourth estaters that rejected any trace of tradition whatsoever, especially Catholicism, even before Christianity, right? And let's be honest, without, again, an awareness of Christian history, you cannot be a dignified human being. There is no way. Like, this is true for many other histories, but this does not make them exchangeable or, accounting for one another. A fully developed human being that can't be defined in these terms should know in-depth church history, and especially escaping this, again, lesser people's meme-based, chicken-brained, underschooled level of subnormality, even for human standards that are inferior as you can get in a metaphysical sense. So we have seen in many videos how the Church in the area, we're talking Rome, of course, let's just to skip any further specifics, focused primarily on spreading Christianity throughout Europe with the purpose fundamentally of reactivating the matrix of spiritual awakening that was necessary, essentially, to reactivate the Imperium after the big crack of the syncope of Western civilization, in the moment in which, according to prophecy, wars, in fact, tales that had occurred after the peak of the Roman Empire, was the golden age of Catholicism in history, between the Bronze and the Iron one, leading to a further degeneration, out of which humanity turning to mankind and divine should essentially be able to eventually emerge, as having reached the bottom according to the eschatological vision of the same, but still contributing, in fact, to that reactivation. In a deep sense, what we've seen in the Investiture controversy, that is instead the high medieval phase of the Church, in which Rome provides herself with a princely, actually monarchic profile, out of the obvious traditional necessity of unity of command, right, and hierarchy, and any level of actually patriarchal order, because it doesn't matter whether the Church is symbolically the mother. Of course, there is a big deal of sort of Bronze Age great mother kind of attitude within the Church. People fundamentally do not understand this. They do not even understand the fact that, as I was saying before, the religions like, the Vodanic one were fully Catholic in nature, and that even though there were sort of substandard levels by that point, essentially by the time of Christ's birth, in terms of, in fact, realizing that it was still possible to save yourself, had nothing to do with a chthonic, paganistic superstition that was essentially the black magic and the lesser people, the feministic and communistic heretical ideology crushed. In fact, well before, like the Christianization of the empire by any Catholic empire, including, in fact, the Roman one, but also others and other communities across. People literally believed that pagan means pre-Christian, and they haven't understood anything about the entire history of religion. I'm not even going to explain there. I think the average person knows what pagan means, even etymologically speaking, and why, of course, it's inherently contained, even just in the word, the trace of what was considered to be pagan. So the lesser level of inferior, powerless, subjected, superstitious, materialistic, lower beings that were lorded over by the great nobles, by the great authority, by the empire, by God's grace, that in the absence of just has this fallen, sinful, incapable, weak, and fundamentally continuously degenerating reality of its own. Of course, the Catholic systems struggling to inform even lesser people, because nobody is really beyond redemption, in the means to reactivate that superiority. You have this great blossomings of Catholic authority with Alexander the Great, with Augustus and Rome, and generally speaking, all that had brought to these the most beautiful chapters in the history of mankind in general. And that can be, in fact, seen with the maintenance of Romanity in a metaphysically ethnic, transcendental meaning, in the purest sense. In the empire, in the Western Empire, what people say that was not, it was just a successor of the Roman Empire. It was the same Roman Empire. That was never, in a theological sense, from anybody thinking at the time, such a thing like, that's not actually Roman. It's another thing. Because there is only one God-given grace. There is not one that, speaks Greek or one that speaks German. It's the same. And when you display that, there is always a reason. Providentially, in the original meaning of the term, so not this sort of spooky thing happening for no reason that you let yourself flowing away. No, those are Fourth Lateran, super deterministic superstitions that were in fact entirely paganistic in nature and had nothing to do, in fact, with the dominating religions of the time, the Indo-European ones and beyond, and in fact is, as you know, connected, even if you know the etymology of the term, with foreseeing the future. And so the capacity of molding through your own, say, wisdom, which has the same etymology of the Latin video, which literally means to see in that sense, and foresee it, molding the world into your own image, in a sense, in the sense that your own image is manifested automatically through the level of grace and thus superiority that God bestows on you because of your own merit and work, right? This is what, in a nutshell, sacerdotium and regnum/imperium were doing. And when we arrive to the investiture controversy, the main issue there is something pretty obvious and straightforward that essentially stems from the fact that since in late antiquity the empire had, or the emperors, to say better, had fallen short of the general Catholic ecumenic expectations, the church had risen to say, well, we will be the checkers of the standard. We want someone who can reactivate those spiritual standards that must receive that level of divine empire. And in fact, originally, when you look also at the early Carolingians, etc., you realize that the traditional role of the church was the one of essentially a priesthood supporting the ultimate ruler and not really having an imperium on their own. Of course, we arrive to a later phase where we realize that the popes themselves claimed the imperium for their own, famously Boniface VIII, quarreling with Philip IV, while the actual emperors, let's say at least the Germanic rulers, were in a sense out of the equation, or almost. And you would wonder why and how one got there. So essentially, the problem of the syncope of Western civilization had stemmed not from Christianization, that is only a consequence, and actually a band-aid on this situation, of the loss in standards of humans. As we said before, all across, this is true also in the pre-Christian world. It's not like, I don't know, in the Germanic world, people believed by Christ that actually they could save themselves, the hero could. They had largely forgotten that. You do find these things scattered here and there in literature, etc., like meaning that there was an idea that the hero could escape destiny, but that at large, by that point, humanity had sort of sunk and degenerated to the extent they had even lost any kind of faith in their own manly power to reachieve divinity. And so, as a consequence, the question was, how do we check this empire? Right? As we explained in many videos, observing the works of the fathers of the church and more, Christianity never meant to undermine the Roman Empire. Their objective was to Christianize it, if anything, and aside from, in that sense, the metaphysical and also cultural implications of Christianization stemming from the Levant, having a different background to it, to the Indo-European world, etc., they still spoke the same language in terms of cycles of peoples who had risen and fallen, and that now were collectively falling once again. But Christians were always pro-empire. The only thing that they not recognized was the divinity of emperors, that in traditional, also in the European terms, had they succeeded, they would have maintained the empire. Instead, in the generalized crisis, the problem is always collective, but in that earthly dimension, that secular dimension, that does encompass the same spiritual one, it's the leader's fault. And so Christians refused. They accepted everything, right? They were Roman citizens. They served in the army. We've seen how there was never, even a single instance, geographically speaking, of the military saints ever being martyrized because they refused to shed blood to kill people. Those were in the army. They worked there. The entire point was not sacrificing to the emperor because they rejected the divinity of the saint. Everything was okay, but we must realize that this is a fallen world, and if you are not really being able to achieve what in Augustine times was still possible, and that started Christianity actually from that very moment, in the lack of a continuity of that standard, we must, as the various estates, have a different organization. And that's where the priesthood had supported the emperor. There are different sort of cultural currents. As we were saying before, the Byzantines, for example, developed a more autocratic and sclerotic system that was a bit incoherent for the mere fact that they still maintained the Sebastocratic ideal of the emperor, but at the same time they were a Christian power, and so they recognized the obvious separation between state and church. Other thing that people do not seem to grasp is that what they refer to separation of church and state in laïcistic and modernistic terms has nothing to do with what actually happened in these later centuries. This is the atheization of the state, which is a completely different concept from the separation of church and state that have always been separated, and that were not separated in pre-Christian times. The empire, the Roman Imperium, was, aside from any kind of modernistic and secularistic understanding of the state and the more material side of it, was the same thing. There was the same Catholic universal religion, and those who officiated it, that originally was just one guy in time of the monarchy, and then splitting the various Roman magistracy, etc., connected to the Imperium, so God's grace, Nika, Victoria, and so on, had been gradually diluted to the point that they were priests themselves at the end of the day, or they were part of the same body that performed the entire rituals of work. We made lots of videos about that also recently, about the maiores, like expugnating religion, as it was said in Latin. Losing that kind of power, and therefore the necessity posed by Christianity to create a priesthood that was to, at that point, to recognize the fait accompli that spiritual standard was not in the hands of laymen as well, and so that a specific estate connected with the sacerdotium that is also part of the general Indo-European tripartition, right? So it's not peregrine, right? But it was, let's say, more organically compacted before. We just said it. At this point, it was split into this more separated estate that could otherwise easily overlap, right? This is true also during the Middle Ages. I mean, you have, I don't know, knights that are also monks or bishops that fight also as militaries, as we've seen in different videos. You have laboratores that are also bellatores and et similia, right? So the notion is that now the bellatores must be sort of prepared, indoctrinated, controlled, and disciplined by the same oratores, who, as the priesthood, has this very important spiritual dimension in hands, represented by the Roman Church, that is also the only one existing in the world, in the sense of metaphysical Romanity continuing in its ecumenic relevance, and literally the migration from Jerusalem to Rome through Peter and Paul, that also represent two, say, different, almost opposite visions of that approach, but fused into one. This is what the center of Romanity, the center of Rome, Rome as the center of the world. I made multiple videos about this, expressed bringing this, again, power of the East to Rome that became truly the East of the West, just like, I don't know, the Goths, these other peoples of the migration era conceived like the rising sun, and they aligned their graves towards the rising star. That was in fact the imperial one and God's power and first. So we are really in the full wake of a completely imperial Catholic tradition that Christianity collects with the same symbols, with the same meanings, that did not steal, but were the only meanings and the only symbols that existed throughout the entire world, and therefore they had to work with, because there was no other, there was no otherness in this. Everybody had them way before them, but exclusively also through them at this point. In the cooperation, those who bore arms, right, the emperors, those who had technically to reunite the world and to, in that sense, to invert the foe, and through, in fact, the cooperation with the church. Many people misunderstand this concept. They think essentially that the empire and the church were two enemies of some sort, and this never happened, because this was a completely extraneous concept to any traditional vision and lifestyle, right? The wars that were fought over the investitures, that, as you know, are another story, because there the point is, who does really command? For example, who becomes priest and who becomes, say, count, knight, and what are the, in a temporal and spiritual reality alike that overlap, like the limits, right? With a church that has property, for example, and that is run by people that, in that sense, implicitly do have an imperium that follows, like, yes, this earthly command, but it is also an earthly command that receives divine grace. And the same is mirrored by the church, because the church is the one that has a contemplative attitude, and action without contemplation and vice versa cannot, in tradition, reach the divine standard. It was true in all the previous religions. It wasn't pure action. There was also true wisdom, as we said before, true providence. And here, say, what we call empire and papacy at large, that we understand in conventional speech mostly as two polities of some sort, other than two natures, right, of metaphysical character come into play and are unavoidably supportive of one another. Nobody ever said like the papacy should not exist or the empire should not exist. Even in the most critical times, just on the brink of the mid-14th century crisis, where John the 22nd and Ludwig the Bavarian were, writing ferocious things against one another. You have, the times of Marsilius of Padua, William of Ockham, Saint Dante, and Egidius Romanus, slightly just some years before, defending respective sides. None of them, even when denying to one or the other any specific power in some field, did so by saying that the institution did not have to exist. On the contrary, that was always and must always remain there, which is what essentially remained until the 19th century, and actually till today, considering the survival of the church as a thing on its own, but meaning considering the necessity of a papacy with an empire, right? Naturally, as we were saying before, the church had its own specificities. For example, it did not technically belong to an earthly domain. Hence the problem of the patrimonium patri and the fact that essentially the papacy had to exercise a degree of temporal authority that at least was handled to the emperor in overlapping in intentionality. Because if you believe that this is a single business with a single purpose, you must go in the same direction. But when the Imperium began to fall short of that protection or starting to abuse its power, the Church then had a power that is Imperium itself to wield against the so-called emperors that, however, have another Imperium against them. That's how, Frederick Barbarossa gets defeated by the Lombard League. Imperium manifests just in the same way power fragments. Like if any power existing in the world derives from God, so even though there are formal divisions and differences that can be also anti-traditional to a degree, the level of power that anybody achieves is proportional to their merit in front of God, that in this sense is boundless. It's not merely being under a single particular banner or even being within a particular religion, because as we were saying before, that depends on the degree by which you are able to exercise divine power regardless of that constraint. That is not to say that religion is not important. It's not the same. It doesn't say that a religion is equal to another. You can simply switch them, right? But say the level of power fragmentation or struggle of Christendom is not just proportional to its own sins. It's also due to whichever merit is to be found within it or aggress in it that you're letting that other person, for example, have, like leaving the initiative to an evildoer that, however, in its margin of success has been doing that aspect well, right? And so you are sitting there doing nothing. It's sacrilegious and, in fact, anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, and anti-imperial in one of the deepest senses of the word. That's where you get to the investiture controversy. That's where you get to a lot of issues that had to necessarily be controlled, regulated by Christianity, just like Crusaders were taking up arms against Islam and recovering what had belonged to them, and in fact cleaning themselves of that sin through blood, like in self-sacrifice in holy combat. This is what the truest and purest meaning of Catholic imperiality means. All right, we made lots of videos about the investiture controversy. Just the other day, we were partially talking about its the aftermath, at least of its formal conclusion, with the Concordat of Worms, that did not really end that, as those incidents we're talking about from the 14th century were 14th century obviously prove. But in this period that, as you know, straddles the 11th and the 12th centuries, the Church's assertion of the libertas ecclesiae, so the liberty of the Church, against secular authorities energized and engaged the entire Christian community in the ongoing conflict between the priesthood, the sacerdotium, and the empire, the imperium. This is also simplistic in definition, meaning, first of all, that the libertas ecclesiae still entails a very specific meaning that is not one of pure freedom. It's something deeper, right? In Latin, you do not have an equivalent to freedom, which is a concept that, in fact, is alien to the earthly domain. Nobody is free by definition but God, right? People, just by the fact of being people, are never free by definition. They have at least liberty. Liberty is a principle of redemption and gradual divinization that is beautifully exemplified by the Roman conquest and rule of the world's people, and that entails essentially a growth within somebody's authority and leadership, which technically applied also in this case to the empire and the Church. Right? The Church at this point was going as far as claiming that any action that the emperor carried out was to be scrutinized by the ecclesiastical spiritual standards, and if found unfit, should have brought to sanction. This makes sense because it's a system of checks and balances. The emperor, in virtue of his own imperium, in fact, could remove a pope from his throne. The Byzantines did that quite often. Like, they also, at least, they had a much greater control, first of all, on their church, but they also killed popes, for example, even though that backfired because 1204 happened in part also for a reason. It wasn't planned really for the conquest of Constantinople, but hey, that's what happens when you sclerotize the system and you just create a subservient church that does whatever you want. The same goes for Islam, that does not even have a priesthood, and therefore that has a chronically unstable political profile, because, of course, in that sense, humanity has not the capacity of handling both, and in fact, the West has an overwhelmingly successful extra gear in this dyad church empire that, even in the investiture controversy, produces one of the most shockingly civilizational outputs in the history of mankind that we see, in fact, in the great medieval civilization as we know it from the Frankish, the essentially Romano-Frankish, Latin-Germanic background that overwhelmed, in fact, the surroundings and beyond, in which, of course, Rome was unavoidably central. So the libertas is reivindicated from the Church, not just because, of course, people exist, like the Church is does not belong to this world, but, say, the priests, the prelates, the Pope are, and part of it, they are humans, and as such, they are claiming, of course, a degree of authority they have as humans, if they succeed with divine grace, and by specializing in that spiritual endeavor, and also having, in fact, an overwhelming millenary legacy from Romanity in its purest Catholic understanding, they are able, in fact, to fence off, to check and balance imperial power, not to the extent that, in fact, an ideal Christian society should have not seen the overlapping of imperium and sacerdotium, but exactly because it didn't happen, proving that the imperial standards that were expected to be the highest, were expected to be the ones of real earthly leadership, were not met in a divine sense, right? So the interpolation of sacerdotium and imperium, for example, the papal crowning, this obsequium that emperors always made to the ecclesiastical authority, even when eventually controlling the church in very straightforward ways in the early Carolingian era and the Ottonian one, they also could simply not control it on the longer run because they themselves were limited in power and would not be able to to handle it at the end of the day. Same goes for the Byzantines. This is a universal thing. Every time we talk about this topic, we're not talking about, as I said before, not a people or another. We're talking about the most standard existing in we understand as existence, that encompasses in fact the whole world. That's the meaning of Catholic, and that therefore cannot be true and false at the same time, cannot be in a way or another at the same time. Everything that happens is the reflection of this of this grace that you're able to receive out of your own personal merit, given this essentially degenerating the connection that this degenerating dimension has still with the higher one, and the possibility of essentially making it re-overlap, re-parallel the same, right? So lots of things were going on. The 12th century is a particularly dramatic one. Of course, when talking about the Fourth Lateran Council, we're talking about a giant in the history of mankind, Innocent III. Right? At this point, the Roman Catholic Church wields the greatest power in her history. Right? This is true for the papacy proper. Innocent III, his times, and how much international events were conditioned by this pope, mark the full affirmation of the inherent superiority of Western civilization, as it had re-emerged from the fall of the Roman Empire. Right? I made multiple videos talking about this for the 13th century. That is the peak of the great medieval Catholic civilization, and that starts exactly from this giants of Western Europe. When we look at the context, we know how complicated, however, the background was, and how glorious this accomplishment was, considering how difficult the premises, the preconditions of this all really were. Right? You can't go as far as saying that Innocent III saved Christendom. There were threats coming from everywhere, first of all from heretics, that at some point will, of course, lose in the measure in which their ideas are wrong, but also exploiting the sins of the clergy, and the fact that, of course, the tumultuous growth of Europe in these centuries had brought to that level, in fact, of let's say hybrid of the same thing that the Church was vindicating for herself regarding her autonomy from imperial power, that is to say, the epuration from corruption, the fact that a functional church was capable of wielding that enormous power in all across Europe, and in the peak of Innocent, exactly because of its purified standards that were achieved. Right? The church had fought against the interference, the collusion of, say, like more material greed from, for example, the lay management of an ecclesiastical dimension, as it had happened when, again, the emperors had controlled the church, in that sense falling short of the overall expectations. You can't say that the church would do the same, because yes, it's human, and so there are no differences in this regard. There were enormous accomplishments from the lay side. Here we do not, of course, criticize the empire. I'm a Ghibelline myself, so I don't actually have anything to say in that reality. It's also, Guelphs did not really exist as we understand them. In fact, in a strictly theological, metaphysical sense, they were all Ghibellines in a way, but that's also another story we'll talk about another time. So when you look at the beginning of the 13th century, realize that the dynamic tensions within religious life, tracing back to the Gregorian reforms, that had been pushed exactly by even those same heretical, say, or at least heterodox movements that at some point never thought that Rome should not be the center of Christianity, for example. This is very interesting, especially compared to what the Reformation will be later. I mean, in the 12th century at large, not even heretics ever thought that Rome being central to mankind, to the cosmos and the universe, and being the center of any kind of spiritual power was a contentious issue. People were traditional enough to perfectly understand why that was historically culturally, morally true. They just wanted to reform, to fix that. And in the worst cases, just creating a sort of church on its own that, of course, would have never had the prestige of Rome, even because they didn't claim it for themselves, but that at least, in fact, was a sort of, in fact, that sense, lower grade winery about how they were all Gnostic heresies. So basically, the most anti-Indo-European concept ever that is to say that if, in this sense, you are poor, stupid, loser, whatever, it's somebody else's fault. This is exactly the psychology of lesser people in a nutshell. And so Gnosticism was saying bail out completely because reality is just created by the devil. If you die, it's better, even though, of course, they didn't want to die. And they actually wanted to wield power on their own. And they failed in any case. They were fortunately exterminated during the Albigensian Crusade. That was one of the most beautiful chapters in the history of mankind. Even today, average, I would say, brackets, lesser people always say those things. Oh, that bishop said God will recognize their own. Do you even know what happens when there is a siege? Right? How do you think that a siege happens and there are just scary, innocent people behind the walls that do not know what's going on, that are, not entering the... Of course, those places were actively supporting the resistance of that fortress against Catholic authority. And without that decisive moral majority, you cannot lead a siege. Like, take it from a guy who wrote hundreds of pages about siege warfare here. If there is no collusion with people who are inside at large, and so even by not acting, giving power to somebody else, in order to let that thing happen, you are actively colluded with that. That's also why, I don't know, the Crusaders exterminated not just Muslims, but also Christians and Jews, taking Jerusalem. It's completely normal. That's what happened in any siege context with anybody. Christians killed Christians, Muslims killed Muslims all the time, and it was completely normal. Also because every single war in the history of mankind, especially in the full Catholic tradition, was exclusively in the name of God. Right? We still have actual people, actual grown adults from a biological point of view, that vote, that have children, who drive cars, who actually believe that the Crusades were holy wars that were invented by the popes in the 11th century, that this was some kind of novelty whatsoever. And this is, of course, being informed. That it's disturbing that even conservatives believe this BS, because breaking down a reality to you, if you are those people who say I'm Christian, but you don't know again shit about the Christian church in history or whatever, and the only thing you have to point out about it's corrupted, you're not a Christian. You're not even a person, you would say. You're just an idiot, right? That opens his mouth and speaks. The point of the bishop was actually pretty cool. Yes, God will recognize his own, because guess what? These are a bunch of mother blippers who kept resisting in arms against us in complete defiance to authority. They did oppose us for no reason whatsoever. Now, God will recognize their own. If they have anything good in them, at that point we'll leave it to God. And here we're not playing stupid games for children, right? And that's how and why you wield a crusade, by the way. If you don't understand this, it's highly unlikely that you will understand any kind of historical reality. It's disgusting how, say, mass society people have been indoctrinated in pretending that what they think personally matters when it doesn't matter at all, right? And this is actually the product of it. The same heresies of the time were wiped out largely by this glamorous and beautiful, wonderful display of Catholic inherent superiority, because they did not obtain God's grace, and so they could not manifest any actual power, and the church was superior to them, right? Different in the Reformation, because there you have also more generalized sin. People, like mankind, is more degenerated further, so the church does not manage to keep things together, but also the other system goes on. Surely freer in the sense of more, resources they can use for themselves, eventually ending up, as you understand, after a few hundred years only becoming atheistic and rejecting any full trace of religion. That's how eventually the thing goes down the line if you oppose Catholic authority. The great challenges of the Church by the beginning of the 13th century, besides these pernicious heresies that were all the same, Gnostic, Manichaean heresy dating from antiquity, passing from Anatolia to the Balkans, then through places like northern Italy, central France, the Rhineland, southern England, etc., like taking root. In fact, what were the most advanced, and in fact, Latin-Germanic, Romano-Frankish centers of the world. This is because it's, again, that's transnational, which is yet another thing that people today do not want to believe because they fear more chicken-brainedly, safe in their safe space by believing that they are any kind of worthy because they belong to a nationality on a passport, and they completely ignore what it means to have a universal divine imperial power that we should all seek to wield over other nations constantly. From our own, there is no doubt that there is a quality and merit if you express it, though, not just if you're an average, lesser human being, which is unfortunately the case for the wide majority of any people. Now, this other factors had brought to, say, like wealth, for example, this unprecedented level of greed, like this booming of the economy. The fact that, in that sense, human nature is weak and gets corrupted along the way. And that brought the Church with the need to adapt to the transformative changes brought about by, for example, the urban revival. Most of the heresies spread in these centers, right? As always, like the countryside is more traditional. You can have there also many changes that go in the other direction, but they have less power. And where power exists, there is always this hierarchy of the top and the bottom. And at the bottom, of course, of the urban world, there are this possessed crowds with essentially communistic intentions that are, in fact, ferociously anti-clerical. They go against, say, even lay power, tendentially want to steal, to rob, whatever. They are ferociously anti-Jewish, right? This other thing, if you feel threatened by people that you deem to be inferior, well, just know that in Catholic tradition, if these people wield the power that you claim they do, it's because you are actually the inferior one. I mean, if they do, they're actually superior to you. You are actually the inferior race. You're actually the lesser people, right? This is the full Catholic tradition. This is also why, of course, the Church and the Empire, the constituted order, had always, of course, not just protected the Jewry in their role that, as you know, is very instrumental to Christian Catholicism. They have to testify to the end times of the correctness of the Christian message, and in fact having their hopefully a chance to redeem up to that point, and in fact instead exterminating these lesser people that at the end of the day were anti-Jewish simply because they wanted to steal wealth, because there were lesser people who could not afford to have wealth on their own. All right, and that's where they remain historically, right? It's not like they went very far. Even if you look at other peaks of this, just know that Hitler, in his bunker before killing himself, actually stated that the Germans were a lesser race that could not win a war, and so they were actually not what he thought. His textual words, by the way. So, just for saying that a minimal coherence in the past existed. Even in the 21st century, nationalistic and or socialistic ideologies producing fascism or communism had produced people who had enough attributes to be able to kill one another for something. Today they tweet. Now, this evolution of the situation compelled the Church to respond to the needs of a society profoundly influenced by faith. As a result, the Church began regulating the religious practices of lay people, enhancing clergy preparation, guiding individual consciences, and overseeing worship and devotions. It was a necessary phase, opening to essentially the late medieval period and the peak of the great medieval civilization, now that the Church had essentially succeeded, miraculously, by the way, considering the absence of essentially any even regional scale military power on its own, to fully affirm itself as a monarchy that will then, in fact, at this point, under Innocent III, basically every Latin country, every Christian country in the West is technically and formally vassal to the Church of Rome. This is incredibly important because it tells you how much sacerdotium and imperium were intertwined, and how much, again, it's not like the Pope could arrive with his tanks, divisions, and knocking at the door and wiping you out if you disobey. It was inherent, the necessity of that world, right? Even the same local church that tended, not always, by the way, to align with the Pope, and were also divided within, and of course, allowing the same papacy to make leverage on such power, even far away, were of course the product of the limits of those rulers, as we were saying before. And so, actually, these were quite obsequious towards the same church, because they perfectly understood what the whole thing was about. A spiritual guidance was needed. Rome had always been there for them. And at large, vice versa, because yes, there were lots of wars among Christians, but aside from the fact that the church, which is what nobody outwardly, reminds, was constantly involved in pacification, right? Surely also exploiting this in political terms to gain more power and to make things go in a direction rather than another, but fundamentally also expressing the need of stopping to spill Christian blood. Right, and directing this effort towards, in fact, a more Catholically imperial direction, which is witnessed also by the Crusades and the general expansion of the West against the non-Christians in Spain, in Levant, in the Baltic, and against the heretics also in the heartland of Western Europe. So. It's incredibly important, as we were saying before, to realize how religiously traditional the society of the time really was. Even though there are, as we were just pointing out, some dynamics that recur in the millennia and in the centuries, the overall level of religious awareness, the one of the sacred, by these communities is incredibly high compared to our own. People at large understand essentially the meaning of this, of this metaphysical condition of humanity, why the church is there, why the empire is there, and they do not even ever comment in, put it into question. And on the contrary, they understand that the problem of salvation is quite concrete. They see it because life is much harder and therefore much more revealing than it is today in its infamous dimension, especially from a spiritual point of view. And this awareness of the sacred makes these people witness the manifestation of power in this world, which is, by the way, nothing short of amazing if you think with the means of the time, the aforementioned control, for example, of the church on Europe, the same organization of power at the time. What we'll see now with the Fourth Lateran Council is fundamentally also the expression of this. Like if nobody tells you like why these people believe in this stuff and why they would spend so many resources, I don't know, to build cathedral, to meet, to convene this synods, the councils across Europe, moving an incredible amount of wealth just to arrive at a place or another, with the risks, with the difficulties of the time. You cannot understand the time. This is something that normally it doesn't get explained to you if you go to university, even when like you attend a good one, because they do exist. They're not just rigged by leftists, and fortunately now that the tide is changing. But it's, in fact, not fundamentally fixing the problem of dimming of the awareness of the sacred in the heart of man. And if you're habituated just to see, things happening as a sort of written, empty stuff that you have to learn because it's kind of history and, I don't know, somebody wrote it, who knows which reason, it's going to be a bit difficult, as I was saying before, to find any kind of solace, satisfaction, and accomplishment in practically any other endeavor. Remember Cicero, who said that those who do not learn history are destined to remain children until they do, hopefully for them. As a result of all these difficulties, that included, for example, the attempt, made multiple videos on this, to frame at least the most, the barely orthodox elements of those, in fact, heterodox movements close to the same Gnostic heresies into the Roman Church, to discipline, to even exploit the good that was present in them, like the counter-intuitive, the sort of the provoking element. Just think about Francis' life and how sort of edgy it actually was. In fact, how many problems the Saint Franciscans would give later to the Church, but at the same time being fully framed within the Orthodox Catholic world. People still again think that, I don't know, Orthodox means the Byzantine Greek Church. First of all, even today's Orthodox Church is formally called Catholic. Secondly, Catholic is the first name of the Church. If you don't know that, like, it's not like the Catholic, the one invented by the Pope, like in the 11th century again, and or just, I don't know, something that is just about Catholic. If you don't know what Catholic means, you cannot, or seriously, you cannot understand your life. You cannot understand your identity. You cannot understand even the most basic information you're ever given by anyone. And it's a theological, a metaphysical concept that destroys basically everything that the world has bombarded us with, trying to make us believe that nothing matters and that there are no standards and that it's all worthless and whatever. No surprise, of course, no wonder that this is the very quite pitiful state of humanity at this point. But just know that it's that simple, just to make an effort and to learn things. So lots of things were going on. Jerusalem had fallen, the Almohads had made a coming back, the heresies were seemingly paralyzing the entire system. It was all interconnected, just like today. You never see a movement that is outside of certain, in fact, Catholic standard of, axiomatic recognition. This was all the usual countercultural, self-sabotaging, communistic, feministic hatred towards standard value, beauty, life, intelligence, and here the Church is at the center of it all, and Innocent III manages to pull the string in a very to harmonize the system in an incredibly delicate way, to bring under his pontificate the, say, Western Christendom literally to the peak of its beauty and superiority, with a Latin Church of Constantinople that is being taken by the French and the Venetians, by the crushing victory of Las Navas over the Moors in Spain, the reaffirmation of Catholicism in Europe through the extermination of the Albigensians, through the integration of the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements in Rome. And this passed at large greatly also through the overall regulation mirrored by the Fourth Lateran Council. Right? The aim was at large regulating the religious practices of lay people, enhancing clergy preparation, guiding individual consciences, and overseeing worship and devotions in a way that would be positively functional to the evangelical message. Right? If you don't know also that Evangelion was used by the pre-Christian Roman Empire as that properly manifest destiny, we could say, sort of an American sounding way, but that of course the providential world conquest, well, it's highly unlikely you won't understand Christianity and also all the rest again. In a Europe that was completely Christian and under the strong political influence of the papacy, Pope Innocent III, 1198-1216, aimed to rejuvenate the Church in its entirety while simultaneously suppressing religious dissent, as we've seen, often through violent means, in response to the alarming rise of heretical sects that were equally violent, subversive, insubordinate, and giving rise to that the degree of societal collapse that is mirrored also by, like the war bands of mercenaries crossing. Think about the Brabançons in France. They were all carrying these pernicious, nasty, violent, anti-clerical, anti-nobiliar beliefs. Again, the Reformation was not a novelty in the history of mankind. Modern people think that modernity invented everything, didn't invent anything. It had always happened for the same identical purposes, the same identical ideas, right? That was just in the 16th century brought to the further level of works equate to zero. My compliments. And so that, of course, shows you that this subversive degeneration in the history of mankind. So literally, like with Calvin saying that people are literally zero, like they can never do anything. They should basically just die because there's nothing they can ever do, ever point. You suck, I hope you die. This is literally what Calvin stated. I'm not kidding, just read his work. Compare this to the 13th century Catholic Church and the pure Romanity of its meaning. And we will talk about this again. So this papal agenda was vigorously pursued through effective governments and the organization of the Fourth Lateran Council. Always remember St. John the Lateran, the Roman Cathedral, the most important church in the West. I will make some videos about it because St. John is St. John, right? It's again the most important religious reference for every Roman Catholic, even before Jerusalem. If you understand how Jerusalem migrated to Rome, as I was saying at the beginning, it was important just to introduce the context of the Fourth Lateran Council. Otherwise, it's useless, like even to understand why this happened. We will make lots of videos on the Fourth Lateran Council. Others are important. This one really addressed a comprehensive array of topics that they included both doctrinal issues, organizational discipline, at the peak of this great medieval civilization. It was being properly enacted by these very regulations, particularly launching a campaign against heresy, limiting the rise of new religious movements, and placing these movements under approved regulations, right? It's actually very, let's say, difficult for, of course, like an average person today to imagine that things like, preventing the rise of, for example, a new idea or thought, and not any of it, but very specific ones, however, just per se, right? Saying repression is bad. It's really not. It's a manifestation of Imperium. If you succeed, it's because, again, the other person is too weak and therefore was actually not better than you because did not have the means, the legacy, the capacity to simply, and just even the support of others to stand their ground for it. And if you manage to enforce that, it's because that you were inherently stronger and had instead the decisive moral majority to enact it, right? And these organizations, like, today I want to, simply let a subversive terroristic movement that says that we should kill people on the basis of how powerful they are, because we don't like them, and you can understand 3,000 miles away, of course, all the inferiority complex stemming from that hysterical reaction, etc. And no, this thing is a mental illness, and as such, you outlaw it. It's just like, what Trump is doing with transgenderism. It's just something insane, stupid, and against the law, because there are some fundamentals against which you cannot go by definition, right? And here we're talking about the supreme spiritual authority. So if you have a problem with that, good luck with it. And always consider that, again, the aforementioned conspiracy theories against the terrible church was powerful, because it was rich and greedy and corrupt, etc., like, do not match any Indo-European identity. Indo-European identity is based solely on the conquest of the entire world. Christianity was achieving that, by the way, with that spiritual standard that could, of course, move divisions, as we were saying before, speaking of Crusades, kings, and so on. But it did so because it had that capacity of conviction. If this had been this terrible system, I say it just because, if you open YouTube, the average kid will be exposed, like, the only thing that there is on the papacy on YouTube is which were the most evil pope, literally. Like, we live in a world of severely disturbed people at large, in any sort of conventional subcultural sense. If you never study even the history of the papacy, how can you even formulate any concept on it? It's, beyond belief to a degree, but that's exactly the problem. People want to deny and be cognitively dissonant and not understanding why this whole stuff was occurring. So you want to appreciate, of course, what the church was doing, including burning these heretics at the stake and actually educating people. Like, if you look at this is not because Schwerpunkt says it, right? If you study, I don't study history of the church, for example. I'm very distant from it. You would think that it's not just because I'm a military historian, but let's say I've never actually researched ecclesiastical history in my academic background. It's not my thing. I've never been particularly interested just to do that kind of work with it. Of course, I'm fascinated with it, as you understand, but just knowing the ABC of historiography, the most updated one, it's all about understanding how, beneficially educational the church was. If the notion is, again, obscurantism, also because mostly this attitude would have existed against those who were against Catholic principles, and mostly happened. In fact, it happened also this time, but we know that it manifested in more marking ways since the 16th century for obvious reasons. The question is, do you realize that the church was the single most impacting promoter of literacy of lesser people to make them better people, in exactly framing them into this discipline, right? How do you think that, in the Middle Ages, if you wrote a book, like, you couldn't write it because there was the church around? First of all, people at large did not care about anything that was beyond traditional, and if they did so, they did so because the entire society hated them. Because guess what? It's not about the terrible church. That is technically actually the people in general. And many of these people were actually also themselves Christian, as we said before, even when fighting actively against the papacy. They didn't say that Rome did not have to be the center of the world, that the Roman Church did not have to happen. There was actually much less theologically radical anti-papism than there was, in fact, in later times. And they were at large fine with the existence of Romanity. Actually, the same poor Obedientians were people who literally created the Inquisition in parallel, except it sucked. The Inquisition was the most guaranteistic and fair, documented and proof-based tribunal, not just of the era, but well until later in time. Like, you didn't want to live in the Protestant world in terms of risk of getting burned alive for things like witchcraft, that to 16th century cardinals regarding crazy women or other stuff, like, was already considered like a ridiculous concept, by the way, and that kept existing places as late as 18th century New England, right? But never mind that that's, you may want to cross that out of the equation comparatively. You have to face that just the papacy was part of a much more advanced civilization than most of the countries that eventually bailed out of Catholicism. If you look at the map of 16th century Europe and of the various confessions, you realize that the wide majority of the Protestant world was severely backward compared to the Catholic one, which is yet the other notion that there would have been some Protestant ethos that made people richer. Well, ask the Scots or the Hungarians if they were more advanced for being Calvinistic, by the way. I mean, we're at the paradox of complete and utter lack of any trace of schooling here. This is not even funny. It's just objectively sad that there are people who believe these things against any macroscopic history, and especially like these things. I mean, you don't even need to get into a university to learn them from the place I come from. Like this is basic elementary education in first world Western countries, and people literally at large skip this because, unfortunately, of course, standards are human standards, and there are shortcomings in the same places, even though they may be the best in the world for that matter. Imagine the rest of the world for that matter. Was it just nothing but obscurity, darkness, severe underdevelopment, and especially nothing tied with any trace of tradition whatsoever, right? Being formally traditional, first of all, has nothing to do with, for example, the degrees of atheism. Look at Russia, for example, that is hallucinatingly filled with an enormous amount of Islamic population and has incredibly high levels of atheism compared to other even post-Soviet countries. In Ukraine is dramatically more religiously traditional and beyond. Also, most of the other post-socialist countries. Or look at the Sharia countries and their level of savage underdevelopment. And frankly, that if that's traditional, well, good luck with that. Sclerotic formalism has nothing to do with the dignity of the superiority of Catholic civilization. That's a completely different story. That's why at the beginning I was warning and admonishing you for that matter. So what did the Fourth Lateran Council discuss in some more strict terms? Like this, first of all, the council was convened in November. Imagine just the setting. This standing out, of course, is one of the most significant councils in the history of the Catholic Church. And also in marking a pivotal moment in its medieval development, so the one of Latin-Germanic civilization as a whole. Held in the Lateran Palace in Rome, of course, that's where, of course, the name stems from. And this council was one of the largest gatherings of its time. Think that there were over 400 bishops from across Europe. 400 bishops from across Europe in 1215. Just imagine what kind of meaning of the superiority of united Europe existed in 1215. Right, the pure concept of European identity shared within a Catholic imperial framework. This is one of the most beautiful things that can ever be imagined. People coming from everywhere being part of a single imperial Catholic Roman identity, setting forth numerous decrees that shaped the Church's doctrine, discipline, and influence for centuries to come. They really wanted to make a difference. The Council's primary aim was a comprehensive reform of the Church. This was always the broader point of any council, was addressing internal ecclesiastical issues as well as the broader Christian world in a deeply political sense as well. Right? How is the world faring? Are we doing well as Church? Are we really regulating the matter as clergymen as we should? Does our flock really have the kind of shepherd that is needed? The council defined, we'll look individually all this stuff as for the single council, because imagine the moment in which they were even discussed as topics, like there were enormous implications from even a lay, a secular point of view. It defined the doctrine of transubstantiation, stating that in the Eucharist, the bread and wine are charged into the body and blood of Christ, with only the appearances of bread and wine remaining, a significant clarification in sacramental theology against heretical interpretations that had been running wild in that anti-Christian sense. Innocent III also called for a new crusade, later known as the Fifth Crusade, as part of a broader effort to recapture Jerusalem from Islamic control, with decrees for funding and organizing these military expeditions. The Church did manage these things, and it was incredibly important to literally subsidize. You see, where do this money go? Right? The Church thus, so of course, to reconquer lands and reestablish like a Christian church. But say at large, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been, generally speaking, particularly autonomous from the church since its beginning. Nevertheless, the church will keep financing with an enormous amount of wealth, incredible struggles. We've seen it as late as 1683. The siege of Vienna could have not been won by the Christians hadn't the papacy funded the relief expedition, and massively so. I mean, putting that together, by the way, the diplomatic ties, never underestimate that sense, the papal international connection, what it means to be at the head of the church. And so an institution that goes beyond and within, far all across, that's what Catalan Catholic means, all the world, and at least the Christendom, but also beyond, because connections existed also with other powers, also in the process of evangelization. We've seen it very often. Now, going back to the Fourth Lateran Council, it tackled clerical discipline by mandating annual confession for all Christians, promoting moral and doctrinal education for clergy, and enforcing celibacy among priests, while also addressing simony and nepotism within the church hierarchy. These were all necessary measures, given that the church reforms had always stemmed from this same concern. The church was the first one to address them in a quite central way. As you understand, they were the single most emergential issues. We're talking about real warfare, real military threat posed by the same Cathars, also to constituted order to other Christians. And it was a terrifying reality that also the lay authorities, kingdoms, and the empire really required. Really, all these bishops were not just a sect of weird people that was working behind the back of the principalities of the supreme lay authority. No, they were coming from the same exact families. They were in contact with them regularly. They were part of the same system. They shared power with them. They were supported, backed by them, because these, like the beautiful aspect of this is that the single bishops could and would enact then what was established by the councils, in as much as they, were supported by that same lay authority that was, in fact, the only one who could fundamentally enact just things like capital punishments, making war, technically, even though, of course, there were warlike bishops. That would be interesting to know, of those 400 bishops, how many of them had really wielded the sword in battle, because as you've seen in a video about 13th century German warrior bishops, in particular the same years, of course there were. It wasn't like a rarity at all. However, to combat heresy specifically, the Church authorized in Rome the establishment of the Inquisition. That's other very crucial passage in the history of Christianity, responding in this way to movements like the Cathars and the Valdensians. The Valdensians, by the way, were perfectly fine burning Cathars' stake. They fully green-lighted Rome. We're in, right? They had radical stances. We talked about the Valdensians. We'll come back on them. They would survive. Also to prove that, let's say, the Roman Church wasn't really exterminating everybody that they didn't like. That's not how it really worked. In order to trigger that, you really would have had to do something extremely dangerous that was conventionally recognized as to be put down in the same way. But the Valdensians, as well as other heretical groups, were fine saying burning those damned Cathars at the stake. Hell yeah. Of course. Like, it's like, I don't know, a terrorist today kills innocent civilians by running a car over children. Why shouldn't we burn him at the stake, really? Under the cross, really? That's something I don't understand. I mean, I understand, of course, that there is a general redemptional principle. You should give it the opportunity. But in general, like, if this is to be, say, coordinated with the broader moral, say, temper of a society, and this accepts, like it was the case at the time, that this was the best way to go, also because problems were much more pressuring than today's, even though it sounds sort of cynical, but that's where great civilizations were forged, like in times of a real toughness there, in coming from the spring of something really big. And here, yeah, I think we could opt for that. The Fourth Lateran Council, you understand why it's often viewed, right, as the high watermark of papal power in the Middle Ages, encapsulating the Church's attempt at reform, extending its influence, and responding to contemporary challenges through the implementation of these reforms, varying across Europe, sparking debates and resistance. By the way, it's not like immediately everybody, even within the Church, would simply obey. Particularly in areas concerning secular powers and the treatment of non-Christians, there were many issues, because at large the Church had a very crystal understanding of how to handle, for example, the enemies of faith, the infidels, but of course also people who had, who knew the situation on the ground, and also were limited in their own ways, were, let's say, aware of the fact that they couldn't simply impose them. Think about the Mudéjars and how the triumphant Spaniards after Las Navas had to manage this enormous non-Christian population in the Iberian Peninsula. They couldn't immediately just impose such a rapid Christianization. Also, the Church was fully aware of this. It's not like they were even asking for hyperbolical or bloodthirsty things at all, but there was also general laziness of other institutions. In general, the Church was much more efficient than lay powers. At least, as you know, they had developed an enormous bureaucracy, an enormous legal production. They had a centralized system. It just was a system working differently from a feudal one. It was just more concentrated in power, and at this point, different systems were beginning to evolve, even and especially from the affirmation of such Catholic hegemony. Because think about the Albigensian Crusades and how France basically recompacted historically on that occasion on the basis of such such conquest, and the possibility from there to develop an enormous level of civilizational control and power. And developing that administration, etc., would make France, in fact, the greatest power, when surpassing the Germanic one at this point. It's all really that consequential. But just think about the epoch-making consequences of the Battle of Las Navas, for that matter. But the Fourth Lateran Council is so much more than this. And again, I'm embarrassed when I make these videos, because of course they are fairly long, they're pretty aggressive, and they do not necessarily get into the depths of the topic. But again, I need to make these explanatory videos. You know that I go in fair depth with lots of things, really. So it's not really about my normal modus operandi, if not for providing a certain amount of content that can properly introduce to these topics. And the Fourth Lateran Council is so much other stuff. It provided guidelines for the lifestyles and education of the clergy, as we pointed out. It required parish communities to support their own priests. The meaning was the one of the proprius sacerdos. So there was a sense of established cooperation between the church and the communities. There was this very significant effort made from Rome to update to an extent, the behavioral standards that were spreading now within the cities. It's not like Rome was not a city herself, and the papacy had not known how to handle, for example, the new historical, civil, social phenomena, etc. But there was, of course, an idea that the papacy up to this point had been essentially manned by not necessarily a feudal backbone, because again there were lots of cardinals also from Italy, from Rome, that, as you know, were feudal areas in many ways, but they represented again a slightly different background, and in fact was separated from other parts of Europe. In as much as, for example, I don't know, the Albigensian presence was in many ways concentrated to Occitania, in that essentially hope for these powers to escape the French and Roman orbit. It's always the Romano-Frankish civilization there, for many reasons. We made videos about the Count of Toulouse, we discussed the Cathars, the same crusade. So the sense, however, was that the new heterodox movements spreading, especially among the Third Estate, right? It's not like the Fourth Estate was so threatening without the support of some Burgenses, for example, that felt like they couldn't handle the new wealth and power that they had received through their own same work, and so they freaked out and they self-sabotage. That's what happens. Just like today. Look at today. Like, we've never been so rich, but now, oh my god, such a great problem to handle this wealth. We get bored, we have depression. It's actually self-sabotage. It's like all completely self-induced. It has nothing to do with what you could positively do. People are incredibly weak. That's yet another problem. Like, even if they had the right ideas, they do not necessarily have the capacity to act upon them. They do not know what straining is, what resistance is, what hard work, effort really is. If not, they think they know, but because they have completely lost how it was before. And so there is this moral malaise that the church wants really to fix in a very good paternal way. I mean, saying, look, we are part of a broader community. We work together to defend Christendom, to expand it further. We are actually doing well overall. We are able to, the same papacy, like to control ever greater amounts of communities, having the resources, having the tools, having the backbone. That is really impressive. Like the Roman Curia, we'll talk about this, is really something at this point. And so you have just to make people feel connected to Rome. Rome is there. Rome is not failed. It's not some kind of strange idea that we thought was starting well and then no, it's always there. People know that, but also and especially the Roman Church is doing so. To prove that as the papacy, they are cool, right? They know how to listen to people. They integrate these heterodox movements that are within, say, the limits of theological acceptability, but that are, in this sense, capable of disciplining, of regulating phenomena, just like, I mean, the mendicant orders are the most important elephant in the room here, like how they really created them to destroy the heretics. The Dominicans really specializing in theological learning, eventually informing the Franciscans with their same discipline and even appearance. We made multiple videos on this, you can check them out, but we'll talk about them all. The Franciscans were a bit more difficult to control, way more heterodox, but also bringing that necessary mysticism that the church needed in order to reaffirm the connections, the context between itself and the rest of the people. I would say that, in fact, succeeding in fully disciplining the Franciscans on the longer run was an incredible feat. Right, we're talking about one of the single most powerful and important achievements in the history of the church till to this day. The council regulated the administration of the sacraments, such as confession and communion, which also had sparked some issues because of the heretics at large. The council instituted a complex framework for episcopal elections, the distribution of ecclesiastical benefits, tithes, the management of relics. These were all crucial issues that we've seen in other videos as well, like the ones about pilgrimage in medieval France, but in a sense spoke of the very deep relations with Rome at that point for that country was so crucial. Also for the Lateran Council, of course, like benefits, tithes, were all connected with not just the general way, of course, the church would really work, would collect wealth in order to administer itself and to be able again to defend Christendom from the infidels, to fight back, to expand the empire, but also with, in fact, the same investiture controversy, because controlling such figures. We talked, for example, about the papal legates. Legate was one of the most binding way to maintain control politically in the ecclesiastical provinces, and a dialogue and cooperation with the local lay authorities and more. So it's really a huge issue, right? Having a dedicated spiritual leader in each parish, strengthening the bond between clergy and laity, was so crucial. The need to maintain the spiritual health of the Christian community, making this felt like down to the lower echelons of the system. This is what, in many ways, the Roman Church had been criticized for. The fact that people had felt abandoned. And most of the times in which this happens, it's not like people actually have any idea of what's going on. Actually, all the times they misunderstand things. That's why many people had taken up arms. This was an incredibly violent world. It was a ruthless one. Many officials, lay and ecclesiastical alike, of course, abused of their power, triggering these cases of revolt. And it's easy, however, at that point to make it worse, much worse actually, just by embracing ideologies that are really not bringing you anywhere. There's a lot of this today too. I mean, in any society, like people think about common criminals, or even people who have more serious psychological and just existential issues. I don't know, breaking the law, living a violent existence, and going nowhere. You know that's just going to shipwreck somewhere, that is going to destroy the person, unless it's actually guided. If somebody comes close and says, look, there is a better way, and even when these communities can degenerate, there is a way to re-elevate them to redemption, by the sense that they have to pay, but when they do, they will have understood better. This is, of course, a broader biblical principle. It's better to have sinned and then to be redeemed than simply having just sit there and not having ever learned, because if anything, it's not that you may have known better since the beginning yourself. It's more like you were too sheltered and you don't really know how powerful the forces in the world can get if you don't grow a backbone. All right. Confession in the Fourth Lateran Council was prescribed to be made at least annually. We're looking at standards that seem pretty lax in general. And in fact, considered in the society of the time, what you see here being negotiated was, of course, churches pushed towards a more disciplined and regular engagement with the sacraments among the faithful. But from the other side, it was also, again, talking to a society that at large was skeptical, because so much evil in the world that they didn't really understand where this could come from, and why also that the institutions wouldn't do something about it. Well, civilization was being built, was being delivered exactly through the Fourth Lateran Council. The general sense that the ecclesiastical benefits were to be awarded to those that upheld the Christians, the church's mission, and the emphasis put on the reform, with ecclesiastical ministers being, in charge, for example, the tithes management for the support of the church rather than for personal gains, is such a relatable, important, and obvious concept. This was a problem of ecclesiastical discipline, but it goes beyond. We're talking, again, also relatively archaic times, to the extent of again, a society that still, this had been the problem since the Investiture controversy, that had witnessed a more privatistic mentality, a feudal one of abuse of power, of just lack of regulation, doing whatever you wanted. This is a mobster mentality, fundamentally. The church was coming up with a more civilized model of behavior, a more orderly, disciplined, and effective one. And this was happening also on the battlefields of the time. We often discussed it. We've seen just recently in the video about tournaments how the 12th century had been that pivotal moment of great struggle to discipline knights into collective ethos and obedience and performance in parallel. So there's no doubt that these initiatives brought to an incredibly positive outcome. Relics were important too in this regard, because you may think we're sort of lost of the problem. It wasn't, because around the pilgrimages really revolved an enormous amount of wealth. The council attempted to prevent fraud and superstition. This is also like again, the church's superstition, is it? Because the entire point of the Catholic Church, as we explained at the beginning, is to fight superstition, is to fight the notion that you don't have to do things yourself because somebody else will take care of that, which is what you notionistically associated to Christianity. That is actually the lesser people's Christianity, that is to say, not Christianity. The church was fighting superstition. I even made a video about this regarding the aforementioned tension between the more Catholic religions, even the non-Christian one, and the paganistic superstition that was effectively contained. Also, it was not really a full threat, but there were, now it's complicated to digress, it's not part of today's video, but in the video about the Frisian religion we discussed as well. What are the balances even within a same system, a same elite, right, between a side or another, because it's not simply about being top or bottom, it's mostly what kind of direction you invest yourself in that way. In order to prevent fraud and superstition, the church ensured that only authentic relics were venerated. This is yet another point. Think about how much the Reformation complained. The church had been tried this over and over again, right? And they couldn't literally control it. It wouldn't be with a lance behind every guy that was trying to establish like a new reliquary center, whatever, and the church could not simply track every single movement, decision was being done. Of course, this was left to the local, in fact, episcopal authority more than much. It was actually pretty effective, right? But maintaining the integrity of sacred practices was really paramount as in danger at large, and the church surely did not work to contribute the flourishing of fake relics. They actually said it out loud that at some point certain objects would be certain images, for example, would be object of veneration. You know, the famous preparing a video about the iconoclasm, or better, the iconodual restoration, but that they weren't the originals, right? It's like Turin's shred. It's like that's more complicated because now again the result, the story. I know it may actually have been from 2 millennia before. We actually know that things were a bit different historically, but that's a good example. You can venerate an image made ex post as soon as it does not become idolatric, and even relics. I will not now digress on the issue of the relics from a theological point of view, but I discussed it in the video about pilgrimage in medieval France, were actually part of the traditionally held and orthodox belief for the church as well, that there was an actual power stemming from them. That it wasn't merely, of course, a material power that you would have to passively expose yourself like to a radiation, but that more, say, physically at large, this was possible, right? Both in body and soul. And so the exact relics, the authentic ones, were really attributed with this enormous power by the same church. So through these detailed regulations, the Fourth Lateran Council aimed to purify, unify, and strengthen the church's structure at all levels, from the behavior and education of its clergy to the sacramental and financial practices that supported its mission. What can I say? It's incredibly important. In hindsight, I could speak for hours and hours about this, but you see, on one side there are efforts made to reorganize pastoral care, to readopt the orphans, let's say, of the church. On the other, acknowledging the inadequacies of the current system and the urgent need for intervention, because it was always urgent. There was a moment in which you could simply sit down and say in any context in history, but it meant, okay, we're fine, don't worry about anything. Now the system decays, and it does so in terrible ways, by the way. And the decision was made to appoint influential preachers who excelled in both action and rhetoric to convince further people. These preachers were expected to collaborate effectively with bishops in preaching, hearing confessions, and providing general pastoral support. This is how the mendicant orders came about. And it wasn't just, again, in an anecdotal sense. Of course, there was a strongly secular issue there, because the mendicant orders at large were active in the cities that are, as you know, the diocesan centers. And as such, they actually compete with the episcopal authority that is jealous at times. In fact, there is this conflict within the cities, where we'll talk this better in another video, but just for saying that we make a lot of content on this and nobody watches it because, hey, nobody thinks or understands why the church is interesting, or why you should know this kind of history. I was like this too at a point. Because until I understood that, how it worked, I didn't know. And so, of course, the dumbest way of doing is substituting knowledge with some kind of conspiracy theory, because that basically prevents you to deliberate from reality and avoiding to confront with it, which is, the best way to go in that regard. But I made, first of all, lots of videos about the mendicant order. We talked about also the metaphysical order of the church in a broader sense regarding the premises I was making at the beginning. But we talk about the foundation of the studio. This would came a bit later, after Innocent passing. The guy was really something, and we will surely look at him better. But we made lots of videos about the mendicant orders also in the cities. There was, for example, one in particular about Humbert of Roman that talked exactly about the spread of, say, the mendicant orders in the cities, and how the urban environment had to be dealt with. And that's an interesting French perspective on the story. I made a video also about the reformed papal patronage of the new monastic institutions that tangentially touches the same, say, similar topics, at least in monastic organization, and how to the ones we've seen today, how, because that's also the monastic element, like mostly the church, of course, disciplines the secular clergy. What's the difference? The ecclesiastical hierarchy, it's the archbishops, the bishops, the priests, the down to the parish from the Lateran itself. We talked, of course, about the early medieval canon collections, but they do not arrive to this point. We talked about the integration of the monastic Pauperistic-Evangelical movements in the church. We talk about Saint Francis of Assisi, that was, of course, contemporary to the events he outlived. Innocent I made videos about Innocent as well. We talk about Catharism and more. So here I wanted to find a video. I don't even remember. Yeah, but the one on about Humbert of Roman is really relevant in the picture. We will come back on councils, the history of the church. We really need to expand far and wide such topic, because as you have understood by now, it's all what this enormous civilization was about. But by this point, I can say the channel has reached such a critical mass that can simply now connect every single thing I do. But I began to make so much that there is some solid connection that you really want to look at, and I'm eager at large to consolidate that further so that the channel can grow, we can really go somewhere and be properly aligned with our duties, so to say. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.